First shoot 2005.
Okay, so he's quite young.
Yeah, fresh-faced. Looking at the pictures, I mean, it's extraordinary that he'd achieved what he'd achieved. And he was definitely the junior partner with Ricky Gervais. He kind of had that physicality that's so sort of appealing as a subject. But I don't really remember much about the shoot other than it was in a studio. It wasn't particularly inspiring, but you kind of do what you got to do because of that sort of amazing physicality. And I think that's something that people don't really give him enough credit for, the sort of clownish nature of his body and the way that he inhabits space.
So the way he uses his body for comedy.
Yeah, I sort of jammed him into this cupboard in the studio. I think there was some building work going on. So I had these lights, possibly builder's lights, but they equally might have been lights that were used to help paint dry when they paint the cove. Looking at those sort of boggly eyes of his, eyes bulging with imaginary riches from XFM.
David Brent becomes a woman, burbles Steve Merchant, eyes bulging with imagined riches.
I sort of used an extension ring on my digital SLR to get in that bit close, get them kind of in sharp and in focus and fill the frame with that wonderful face of his.
Any challenges you found? So apart from being in a just contemporary studio?
Not the best location, but a pretty good location. Of studios that I've shot in, it was one of my favourites. It was called Jasmine. I shot a really wonderful picture there of Rosamund Pike, where you're looking down on her and she's sort of in amongst all the wires and cables on the floor. So it had good daylight and I utilised all the different elements that I could.
Cool. And it was one of your first shoots with digital, right?
That's right. So a couple of years before I'd sort of made the switch. So I was in a sweet spot. I got used to the equipment. For the first few shoots shooting digitally, I'd bring two sets of cameras, all my film cameras and all my digital cameras, and I'd shoot on both, which kind of turned your brain to scrambled eggs. But by this stage, I'd got used to all the benefits. And in fact, it's an interesting thing to ponder. I think when you're shooting on film, it gives the subject a little oasis of calm when you change the rollover. And it's a bit like smoking cigarettes. It's a sort of system that regulates your breathing. It's perverse. It sounds sort of the antithesis of breathing. But when you're smoking a cigarette, you smoke a cigarette, it regulates your breathing and you're forced into a rhythm. And I think that's one of the reasons, alongside the powerful addictive properties of nicotine, that makes smoking so appealing. But similarly, when you're shooting on film, inadvertently, a byproduct of shooting on film is you have these moments where you can take a breath. Your assistant,
meditative.
Yeah, your assistant is loading the camera and you can have a little quiet word with your subject. How you doing? How you feeling? You know, what did you have for breakfast? Whatever. Whereas if you're shooting on a big memory card, you could literally keep photographing for 2,000 pictures.
You know, wear them out.
Wear them out and wear yourself out.
Yeah, it's true. And maybe that's why you might not like to hear this, but I do think there's a difference between your film and digital pictures.
Yeah.
I can't put my finger on it, but...
Are you saying my film pictures are better than my digital?
I love your film pictures and I also love your digital, but there's a slight change in style. I definitely
think it's difficult to differentiate yourself as a photographer if you're all using the same equipment. And we all were using a Canon 5D, most people.
Okay, interesting. So at least with film, you've got the combination of film stock and
there's
camera.
film stock, there's cross-processing, there's light. There are other elements, there are more variables.
So you stand out a bit easier.
Yeah, I think there is something about the format as well, because a digital SLR is a 35mm shape, and which is fine, but I think more of a sort of dumpy shape or even a square, it gives more room, space for the image to breathe somehow.
Definitely. So that was the first shoot. A few challenges, maybe not as fun being in a studio compared to the second shoot, in which, well, we'll go into that now.
Well, the second shoot, 16 years later, was in Clifton in Bristol. Now, most of my sort of portraits of what he was, an internationally famous person, would be in London or New York or somewhere like that. But it presented a real problem because it was just after all the lockdowns. It was really, really tricky. He was filming the Outlaws. He had the leverage. So he basically said, if the Guardian want to do an interview and a photo shoot, it has to be near my home. Good luck finding a location. So it was really tricky.
And traditionally, is it always the photographer's job to find the location?
It varies, but quite often scarce resources, time being one of those things that is scarce, mean that stuff just gets pushed onto the photographer. And I don't mind getting involved because if you can have a say where you're doing the shoot, that's better.
Makes your job easier.
Yeah, absolutely, because I'd much rather find somewhere that has a bit of daylight.
Yeah. So you decided on Clifton College.
Well,
Did you say that?
I was scrambling around, ringing friends who lived in Bristol and getting nowhere. And then suddenly, as is so often the case, something just popped into my head and I just thought, yeah, Clifton College. I went to Tiverton Comprehensive. You know, I'm not an alumni of one of these fancy schools, but I have met people who've been there and I knew that it might be architecturally interesting. It's been around for a long time. And it was. I phoned them up and it was a bit of a punt. I went into salesman mode and I sort of said to them, you know, have you got a school, you know, a student newspaper, you know, and I suggested that maybe they could do an interview with Stephen Merchant. I was writing checks that I couldn't cash because there's no way he was going to agree to that. And I sort of said, you know, maybe you could document the fact that you've got this shoot happening in these august halls of the school. They went for it. I mean, I think they were quite happy to help, and they also were going to get paid £100, which was really good value.
How much would at that time a studio cost?
Well, probably a studio would cost several times that. It was a bargain.
And it's almost, you get plenty of natural light. It's probably...
Yeah, it was a sort of hall. I might have had a stage, but it had lots of chairs in it, a kind of refectory hall or whatever. It's very typical, modern building. And it was a great base. I used that as a way to get access to the school and the various different locations around the school. So I arrived there early. I think I didn't have an assistant, so it was, you know, as I say, lockdown and things were very, very tricky. So I put a notice on Twitter, does anyone want to assist me in Bristol? And I found someone and she was great.
Do you remember who it was who assisted you?
Yeah, Ellie Smith. She was doing an MA, I think, in fashion, and she responded and I DM'd her and she was a great help.
And her dad dropped her over?
Yeah, well, her dad, actually, she and her dad went to, I think it's called Calumet. I don't know what it's called now. You know, the shop where you buy camera gear. And they went and picked up a big roll of Colorama and they brought it along to the location.
Oh, specifically for the shoot?
Yeah, and she was brilliant.
That's very sweet.
Yeah, it was great. So I was in this hall and I set up my roll of green Colorama, I think, and I had other Colorama, grey maybe. And I did all my usual kind of studio type things that the Guardian wanted. And then I started to go off, as I like to, on a tangent. I mean, it looks quite chaotic in there. All the chairs are all piled up in the corner. And I just think it would be fun to kind of get him to clamber over these chairs or sort of like stand in this kind of big heap of furniture. So I did that. And then I got him to sit on a couple of 3 or 4 chairs, I think I'd stacked up, to emphasize the length of his legs.
Yeah, it really showed off his stature.
Yeah, because he is officially a giant.
Oh, yeah, he told you that, didn't he?
He did. Yeah, if you're over a certain height, it makes you a giant. I think 6'7".
Do you think he was telling the truth, or that was
No,
comedic?
I think he was being authentic.
Okay.
I think he was sort of...
Sounds like he's almost taking the piss, but...
Yeah, no, I think he kind of lives with the puerile humour of people making comments and jokes, and I don't think we should add to them.
No.
I mean, I was just using his physicality. So it was fun playing with the chairs, and I think they worked quite well. They're quite subtle.
You did some headshots as well.
Yes, yeah, to focus in on those wonderful eyes of his, big eyelashes, sort of green eyes. And then I thought, now I've got something in the bag, I can then sort of venture out. I'd found all these locations that I'd sort of recorded on my phone just as an aid memoir to ensure that I'd sort of had a clear idea of where I was going to take him, because I was starting to lose him. His obligation to be in a photo shoot was probably coming to an end. So I wanted to ensure that he wasn't hanging around. And he was starting to get quite irritated with the kind of gaggle of posh kids that would push past him in their fancy uniforms and so on. But I got him on these stairs that worked really well architecturally. They're sort of I was very square onto it, quite industrial, but quite sort of corroded and rusty. It had a sort of an old kind of patina, and then various places around the college. And then finally, it all came together. There was a sort of two buildings right next to each other, and they're really old buildings. And curiously, there was this sort of little sliver, a little kind of concave area to squeeze him into. And that's what I look for. It all came together. That's the magic, you know, that's the secret sauce. The clothes that he was wearing worked with the tones of the stone. The light was in the right place. Making sure I didn't fall at the final hurdle, just ensure that he's not too in on the joke, that he looks slightly kind of irritated at being put into that space, because that's funnier than him sort of smiling and saying, look, I'm in you know.
Yeah.
And it's better if somebody is serious. It's funnier if someone's serious. And that's my favorite picture.
A bit more mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example of, initially I was struggling. I was more concerned with not screwing this up. And then, you know, driving back down the motorway, you know, I knew that I'd got that shot. And I don't think the Guardian actually used that picture, but I like that picture. That's my picture. That's the picture I'm going to put in my portfolio if I decide to have Stephen in my portfolio. It's a great example of something that Jamie Windsor talked about in his video when he interviewed me. He made me ponder something that I'd not really reflected on. And that is, it's not just about people. It's not about photographing people. You know, I love that connection and recording that relationship I have with a person on the day. It's also about the weirdness of space and the graphic relationships and shapes of things. And quite often, before I photographed people, I would just photograph spaces. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. And it was something that we talked about in Jamie's brilliant interview.
Yeah, check out his video. Amazing filmmaker. I've got a lot to learn from him. So
Me too.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a wonderful interview. The best interview that I've done, you know, and I've been interviewed by the BBC and Sky Arts and so on.
100%. I mean, the quality alone, the storytelling, everything,
Yeah.
completely trumps all the BBC shows you've been on. And
We've got a long way to go.